This week on Newsnight, as delegates gather for the DNC in Chicago, Florida Democrats place a focus on Amendment 4, a look at what the abortion issue might mean for the prospects of both parties in November. Plus, this week's primary elections in Florida. Newsnight starts now.
Hello, I'm Steve Mort. Welcome to Newsnight, where we take a deep dive into the stories and issues that matter to Central Florida and how they shape our community. First tonight, the Democratic National Convention and what the gathering in Chicago tells us about the November election in Florida. As the party celebrated their nominee, Vice President Kamala Harris, Florida State Party Chair Nikki Fried told delegates this week that the ballot measure on abortion marked, quote, an inflection point and would make Democrats competitive again in Florida. More on that later in the program. But according to many commentators this week, the DNC's official seating chart perhaps best illustrated Florida's waning influence in Democratic politics, with delegates seated way at the back of the convention hall. Nevertheless, the polls appear to be narrowing in the presidential race in Florida. A poll from Florida Atlantic University shows just a 3-point gap between Trump and Harris, compared to a 7-point lead for Trump in a UNF poll at the end of July. Well, I sat down this week with political scientist Aubrey Jewett. We talked about the primary results from Tuesday, but we started by discussing Vice President Harris's chances in Florida in November.
I think the polls are accurate. Of course, we won't know for sure until we actually have an election and see how close it really is. But according to most polls, ever since Joe Biden stepped down, Democratic enthusiasm has just gone through the roof, and that includes Florida Democrats. When we get some more data points, another election or two, another presidential election or two, we'll know better, because maybe we are really a red state now, but we really don't know for sure until we actually get those election results. I think that from the national Democratic perspective, they know Florida is such a big state that if you really want to be competitive in terms of money and spending ads, you have to spend hundreds of millions of dollars. And every dollar that's spent in Florida is a dollar that's not spent in a state that they think is more competitive or more winnable.
Let's pivot a little bit to the primary elections that we saw this week. We now have the US Senate race set. It's going to be incumbent Rick Scott, of course, against Debbie Murkelsel-Powell for the Democrats, who won her primary. What do you think about that race? Is it going to be close? We've seen a couple of polls of late showing about a 4-point gap between the two. Rick Scott is no stranger to close races, right? Do you think he's likely to pull that out?
Yeah, I would say that Rick Scott is still the favorite in that race. He's the incumbent. He has a history of winning close races. He has several $100 million of personal funds, and he's shown in the past that he's willing to spend quite a bit of it if he needs to win. So, and of course with the Republican registration advantage as well. So for a variety of reasons, Rick Scott's still the favorite. But for an incumbent, he's not particularly popular. His popularity ratings in Florida aren't real strong, and we have seen some polling numbers that suggest Murkelsel-Powell is within striking distance, maybe at the very edges of the margin of error of those polls. So I do think that potentially is a close race. In some ways, I think that might be a closer race than even the presidential race in Florida.
Governor DeSantis himself was not on the ballot this week, but some of his policies were, particularly education. He put endorsements in again for school board candidates throughout the state, 3 of them in Central Florida. One of his endorsements won in Brevard County. 2 others are going to go to a runoff. And I wonder whether we can say how successful the governor has been in trying to flip these school districts, and whether or not people are buying what the Republicans are selling when it comes to education.
Well, I think we can compare his record for this election to 2 years ago. And 2 years ago, he was really successful. He did about 30 endorsements and about 25 of them won. So that's a great record. This time around, he made 23 endorsements, and as of today, 11 people have already lost, and some others are going to runoffs. I think it shows that Governor DeSantis' powers and endorsement may have peaked, and they're not as strong as they were. And particularly when you get into districts that are not ruby red, right? It's one thing he made a lot of endorsements 4 years ago in very Republican counties. And so then it was just a matter of swaying which Republican, you're going to go for. Now you're looking at some districts that are more evenly divided, and I think there's a lot of people who are voting in these local elections that are a little more suspect of his motives and of the Moms for Liberty and that sort of thing.
All right, you can find my full interview with Aubrey Jewett on our website, wucf.org/newsnight, along the bottom of your screen. But let's bring in our panel now to break it all down. Joining us in the studio this week, Sharon Stone from Central Florida Public Media, host of the Engage program over there. Thanks so much for coming in, Sharon.
Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate your time. Skylar Swisher writes about politics, among other things, for the Orlando Sentinel. Good to see you today, Skylar.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. And Alexa Lorenzo, morning host at WFTV Channel 9. Thanks for coming back to the program as always. Alexa, thanks for being here, guys. Skylar, let me start with you on this. We'll talk about the primaries in a moment, but I just wanted to get a lay of the political land, if you like, in Florida post-DNC. Do Democrats, do you think, appear to be making inroads in Florida now, especially if they can get a post-convention bounce? Or the sort of recent history suggests that winning is going to be tricky for them here. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely feeling a lot better. And if you look at some of the polling, it is tightening. One poll showed a 5 percentage point lead that Trump has. Another showed a 3 percentage point lead. But that's better than what the polling has been showing in the past when Biden was the nominee. So there's certainly a lot of enthusiasm. But as you mentioned, if you look at the trends, last election, 2020, Florida kind of parted from the rest of the nation, and Trump actually saw gains here.
Yeah, it's interesting, as I mentioned, that UNF poll in my intro where Trump had a 7-point lead just towards the end of July. Sharon, I mean, how are Democrats saying that they're harnessing that energy that they think Kamala Harris is giving them in this state?
Yeah, I think the energy is real and it's evident in the polls closing, but how do you harness it? How do you sustain it? One thing that they're doing, and specifically billed as a way to take that energy and translate it into voters, is they're doing this weekend of action. It was leading up to the DNC, and it was like more than 40 events around the state of Florida, and it was just to get people involved. And they hit areas you may not necessarily think about. They did a golf cart parade in the Villages, which we know tends to be conservative, and just harnessing that excitement and seeing if they can translate it to voters. And it all leads up to Thursday night with Kamala Harris taking the stage. And they have some official watch parties, they being the campaign, the official Harris campaign in Florida. And I was reading about it, and there's 4 of them, and one of them actually is in the Orlando region.
And you're using volunteers, of course, and trying to harness energy is a lot cheaper than trying to buy expensive television time in a state like Florida, of course. I mean, what are we seeing in other Sunbelt states? How does Florida compare to, say, North Carolina, for example, when it comes to that sort of momentum shift?
Some of the polling shows that it's neck and neck between Trump and Harris right now. Harris is slightly ahead in North Carolina and Arizona, with Trump having the edge in Georgia and Nevada. And this is a big shift from what we saw when President Joe Biden was the candidate in May. He was up 10 points in these states. So we're seeing that shift now with it being so neck and neck. And right now polling is showing that what has Harris ahead in some of these states are minority groups. She's leading with black voters in Georgia and North Carolina by a large margin. She's leading with a narrow edge with Hispanic voters as well in Arizona and Nevada. So it's going to come down to very, very close margins in these Sunbelt states.
Certainly we expect Georgia to be a key swing state this time, much in the way that Florida used to be, of course, back in the day. How's the GOP responded, Skylar, to this recent polling in Florida? And does the response from the Florida party kind of line up with what you're hearing from Republicans in the state?
Yeah, so in response to these polls, the GOP chairman in Florida, Evan Power, sent out an email essentially saying that he found this to be extremely alarming. Of course, I mean, this is a fundraising email, so they're trying to get people to open their wallets. They're not going to send out and say, hey, we got this, don't worry about it. But when you talk to Republicans, I think they feel pretty good. I mean, DeSantis won by 20 points in the midterm elections, which also parted from the trend nationally. The Republicans have 1 million voter advantage in terms of active voters. Now the Democrats say that number is slightly skewed and exaggerated. But when you look at the 2020 elections, Democrats actually led in voter registration. So I think the Republicans are feeling pretty good when it comes to Florida and the presidential election.
Well, as we go into November, we have lots of information on the candidates and issues as part of our voter guide. You can find that at wucf.org/vote. Well, let's switch gears and talk about the primaries here in Florida. And Skylar, let me start with the U.S. Senate race. Senator Scott and the Democrat, former member of Congress Debbie Mucarsel-Powell, both won their primaries quite easily. What do we know about the two sides, how the two sides view their chances now in November, and how is that race set up?
Well, I think Senator Scott, the Republicans feel pretty good because he is the incumbent, and when you're the incumbent, that's a huge advantage.
Yeah.
However, with that said, I think Democrats think there's an opportunity there, and what they're really pointing to is some of the polling in terms of Senator Scott's favorability ratings. His favorability rating in this poll was about 35%, and nearly half said they had an unfavorable view of Senator Rick Scott. So I think the Democrats think there's an opportunity there to maybe to unseat him. However, I think in Florida it's going to be a definite challenge.
Pretty much mirroring what Aubrey Jewett was saying there at the top of the program. There weren't many surprises when it came to incumbent members of Congress, but one particular congressional race that could be interesting in November is Congressional District 9 in Osceola County. We know that Republican Thomas Shalafo will take on the Democrat there, Darren Soto. What are Republicans saying about their chances in CD9 when it comes to November? Do they see that as a key potential pickup?
I feel like I'm about to repeat what Skylar just said, like we're optimistic, but you always have to be cautious. So yes, they are optimistic about unseating the incumbent, and they are touting the experience of Shalafo. He's an Army veteran, former Osceola school board member. Campaign, he talked about being a businessman, not a career politician. That said, he has also in his campaign very much tied himself to a America First agenda and a Trump supporter. District 9, just the fact is, it includes parts of Orange, Osceola, Polk County. We're talking cities like Kissimmee, St. Cloud, Hunters Creek. In recent presidential elections, it went blue. Joe Biden won it over Trump, and Hillary Clinton won it over Trump prior to that. So just there are more Democrats there. So I don't know how realistic it is, despite the optimism.
I mean, Sharon's right, Alexa, but we have seen a push by Republicans, right, in recent cycles to win over that Puerto Rican vote, which is a big part of the constituency in Osceola in recent years.
Absolutely. Across the state, there's 1.1 million Puerto Rican voters who have a chance to really sway things. And we can go on and on. We've done several stories about the Latino vote is not a monolith. Politics on the island in Puerto Rico are not what they are here. So it's a different dynamic when people move here to understand who they're voting for, what they're voting for, and how the process works. Historically, when they move, they lean Democrat. So we have seen recently the Republicans make that push with the Puerto Ricans. They know what they can do if they get them on their side, pushing issues like the economy, pushing issues like the openness to statehood. We saw Governor Ron DeSantis' most recent election, when he ran for re-election, he grew with Puerto Rican voters.
Yes.
Marco Rubio had no issue with Puerto Rican voters. 54% of them supported him in 2022. So we continue to see them leaning red.
And that push has been taking place, particularly since Hurricane Maria, and our Puerto Rican population just
300,000 people
grew so
moved.
Significantly. Let's just stay in Osceola a moment, if we can, Sharon. The county's first Hispanic sheriff faced a very tough battle with fellow Democrats to earn the right to run in November. He did prevail, but remind us of the difficulties that faced Marcos Lopez.
There have been some significant, serious ones there. Many controversies, frankly. Osceola grand jury, they didn't end up pressing charges, but I think your viewers might remember this case. The death of Jaden Baez. He was behind the wheel in a Target parking lot, and police or deputies were responding to a shoplifting call. They surrounded him in unmarked vehicles and shot and killed him. The grand jury was very critical of the department, saying that should not happen, and that was due to a lack of training there. So that was something that happened under his watch. Another recent one is the sheriff, Lopez, was accused of posting a picture on social media, and it was shortly after they found the body of Madeline Soto, the 13-year-old who was murdered. The sheriff said it was an investigative photo that had been accidentally posted on his account. It happened hours after her body was discovered. And then after that, the state attorney even raised questions about some inconsistent statements the sheriff made about the posting in the months that followed. So there have been some significant controversies there.
Let's turn to a story that you've been covering, Skylar, and that is the state attorney's race in Orange and Osceola. Seth Hyman won the Republican primary race there. There's an interesting dynamic here, right? Because he'll take on not only the Democrat, Monique Worrell, who was suspended by Governor DeSantis, but also the governor's handpicked choice for that job, Andrew Bain. I wonder where Hyman stands on Worrell's suspension in the first place, and why challenge Bain, who's running, I think, as an independent?
Right. So in terms of the suspension of Monique Worrell, he said he 100% supports the governor's decision, and he's been extremely critical of Monique Worrell. He says he'll be a traditional prosecutor who's going to work with law enforcement. In terms of why he's running, I've asked him that. He said he was in the race before Monique Worrell was suspended. He declared his candidacy, before that happened. In terms of Andrew Bain, he's been, at least my observation, he's much, I guess, more reluctant to criticize Andrew Bain. I did ask him last night, actually, what sets him apart from Andrew Bain in his eyes. And he said that there have been some kind of community-based programs that the state attorney's office has done, for instance, a literacy program. And his view is that they should just be focused on prosecuting crimes. So that was at least one distinction that he drew between himself and Andrew Bain when I spoke with him.
I want to talk about a couple of supervisor of elections because these were important races. The Republican supervisor of elections in Seminole County, Chris Anderson, lost. That was after a contentious clash with his fellow Republican, Amy Pennock. Describe the legal fight there, Alexa, just in very recent days.
Yeah, a lawsuit was filed by a supporter of Amy Pennock who ended up winning, and they claimed that the current supervisor there violated state law by they're accusing him of soliciting voters during the early voting sessions, using signage improperly in voting booths on some of the writing utensils there. So this was very contentious to start. We saw several objections, a lot of arguments from attorneys, but ultimately it came down to a judge saying there wasn't enough evidence to prove that Anderson violated any laws. That happened the day before the primaries. So that was over and done with in terms of, okay, he didn't violate any laws, but this without a doubt shook up his view or voters' view on who he is as a person, a political figure, his character, and then, of course, injected more controversy and disruption for voters.
Very contentious race. Skylar, you wrote about the supervisor elections race in Lake County that was also watched closely. The incumbent there beat a challenge from somebody who said that he didn't think that Donald Trump lost the election denier, if you like. What happened, and does it mirror defeats for other election deniers that we've seen in other races elsewhere in the country?
Yeah, this was an interesting race because Alan Hayes has been very outspoken in terms of defending the election system. He had a challenger by a guy named Tom Vail, who actually campaigned on a platform of making it harder to vote. He wanted to do away with early voting. Essentially, he just wanted people to vote on election day. Well, Alan Hayes won by a pretty substantial margin, and he, told me that he thinks it just shows that people do have confidence, in the job that he's done and the election workers there. And it kind of mirrors what we saw across the state. There were about a half dozen election supervisors who had primary challengers who were election deniers, and none of those election deniers emerged victorious. And it also kind of follows somewhat of a trend that we saw nationally in the 2022 election. So it does appear, at least for now, that a lot of these election deniers are not succeeding with voters.
There are obviously many races we couldn't get to here, including some nail-biters and races that will go to runoffs in Orange County. We'll put up links to our colleagues' full summaries of the results of Tuesday's primaries on our website, wucf.org/newsnight. All right, next tonight, Amendment 4 is set to appear on the ballot in November in Florida. It aims to add protections for access to abortion to the state constitution. This week, the Florida Supreme Court ruled against the sponsors of the amendment, including Floridians Protecting Freedom and the ACLU. Advocates had wanted to strike a state panel's financial impact statement attached to the amendment, claiming it was designed to encourage voters to reject it by including the potential costs to the state of hypothetical lawsuits. Here's the ACLU's Keisha Mulford.
They are looking at the financial impact on litigation, on, I believe, like Medicaid, and things that are not appropriate for what their position is. So we are to look at potential like local impacts, not whether or not litigation will commence years from now. And that's what the state has done.
Meanwhile, some faith groups are joining the fight against Amendment 4, urging their followers to vote no. The Florida Conference of Catholic Bishops is backing Florida voters against extremism, also known as the No on 4 Political Committee. Lady Rivas is with the Catholic Charities of Central Florida.
We have to really understand what the Lord, the giver of life, the author of life, is sharing with us in this moment in time. Our teaching tells us all human life is sacred. It has dignity from the moment of conception all the way till natural death, to their last breath on this earth. So we want to make sure that folks understand that and understand what resources are available, and specifically in this amendment, and why we're voting no against this. And we're hoping that folks understand why it's so urgent in this moment in time.
All right, then let's break this down. Skylar, you've covered this story closely in your reporting for the Sentinel. From your work, what is the extent of the spending and activism on this amendment from Catholic groups that we just heard from there?
Yeah, so in terms of financial support, when you look at the various dioceses, the Florida Conference of Catholic Bishops, they've given somewhere, last time I checked, about over $300,000 in direct financial support. But they're also providing a lot of in-kind support, campaign consulting. They've put together resources, prayer cards for parishioners. So they're definitely taking a very active stance on Amendment 4.
I mean, are there any fissures, though, among Catholic groups on this, or is it a fairly unifying issue, do you think?
There's absolutely fissures, especially when you look at the church leadership and parishioners. Pew Research shows about 6 in 10 Catholics generally support abortion rights. Yeah. And only about 1 in 10 Catholics support the position that abortion should be illegal in all cases. There's also a group called Catholics for Choice that's very much advocating in favor of Amendment 4, and also taking the position that they don't feel like the Catholic Church should be getting involved financially with this issue.
I mean, is it legal for the Catholic Church to be involved? Is there a tax-exempt question here?
This is a very complicated issue. So yes, like religious organizations are not supposed to make direct endorsements of candidates. So that's not really happening here. In terms of political issues, what the law says is they cannot engage in substantial lobbying. However, they don't really define what substantial is. And the IRS is very reluctant to get involved in these cases because churches can argue that they have a First Amendment right to speak out on issues. So I think the last time the IRS even attempted to take action, according to an expert I interviewed, was in like 1992. It's very unlikely that the IRS would get involved and try to take action against a church on an issue like this.
Well, let's talk about the political realm here. Of course, some very high-profile Republican leaders in Florida politics are throwing their weight behind the No campaign, including Governor DeSantis. Sharon, Democrats in Florida hope that Amendment 4, as I mentioned earlier, will drive their base to the polls. But the subject's been on the ballot in several states in November, right?
I kind of feel like I have to put an asterisk by my answer because it's being litigated so much and there's so much changing. But sitting here talking to you now, yes, there are about 9 states that have or are trying and are close to getting it on the ballot, so voters will decide whether to have the right to an abortion in place in those states. That there's some legal battles I was talking about. It could go up to 11 states, but decisions actually just this week cleared the way for Arizona and Montana to put the right to an abortion on the ballot and put it to voters. But I also like to point out, keep in mind that even prior to this, after the Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade, there were 7 states that already put the abortion question to voters. California, Kentucky, Ohio, some of those states. And one thing to note there is abortion supporters won each time there.
Well, let's put some numbers on this. A recent survey, Alexa, showed how many women get abortions and their political affiliations. This is a fascinating number. What are those numbers revealing? And could this be an insight into whether Democrats could use this issue to their advantage, do you think?
Yeah, the nonprofit KFF looked into this, and they did a very detailed research report. We work with them often on a few stories, and the data that they pulled suggests that near equal shares of Democrats, Republicans, and even independent women have sought out abortions in the past. The numbers are very close. 12% of Republican women, 14% of Democratic women, and 15% of independent women. And it went on to analyze that 1 in 10 women who call themselves pro-life women have received an abortion. So for some, this was not a surprise. For others, it was a shock being so close. They also found that in Florida specifically, 72% of women of reproductive age believe abortion should be legal. 51% of Republican women agree. So we could see Democrats use this data for their push, but at this point, everyone's kind of analyzing different elements of this report because it was so wide-ranging.
And of course, we won't know for sure how this will all play out until people go to the polls in November.
Right, this may not be how they vote.
Exactly. So we'll wait and see on that. Meanwhile, we always want to hear your thoughts on the news of the week. Be sure to visit us on social media. We're at WCF TV on Facebook and Instagram, and you'll find us on X as well at Newsnight WUCF. But that is all the time we have for this week. My thanks to Sharon Stone, Central Florida Public Media, Skylar Swisher from the Orlando Sentinel, Alexa Lorenzo from WFTV Channel 9. Thank you guys so much for coming in. Really appreciate your time today. We'll see you next Friday night at 8:30 here on WCF. In the meantime, from all of us here on Newsnight, take care and have a great week.